Hi, welcome to Color Light Motion, created and hosted by Victoria Vesna. I'm Bess Rocklitzer, president of the David Vermant Foundation, and today we are pleased to bring you Anuradha Vikram. Anu is a writer, curator, and educator. They are a guest curator for the upcoming Getty Pacific Standard Time Art and Science exhibition at UCLA, and we know you are going to enjoy her talk today titled Organic Machines.
Thank you, Bess. It's always a pleasure to do these episodes, but this time I'm particularly excited, actually, is the word I'm looking for, to introduce Anuradha and her viewpoint of the Namjoon Paik's work, the participation TV to start with. And we're also lucky to have Simon Leung to be a respondent. Simon is an artist and professor of art at UC Irvine. And he's done a lot of work as an artist, but also site-specific works on the body, meditations on Duchamp, Smithson, Poe, and Kant. And before we start, I just wanted to relay one story that David Vermant would always give whenever we would have a tour of the collection, and in particular of the participation TV. He was describing how he went to the Howard Weiss Gallery, 1969, I think, and loved the piece and wanted to buy it immediately. And Namjoon Paik said, "No, I'm not selling it." He was very protective about his TV work at that point. And this was shocking to David, probably to the gallerist too. So he asked again, and again, the answer was no, it's not for sale. And then he even tried to get him to do a version of it and buy it. And he said no. It was just this insistent no. Eventually, he kind of just gave up and thought, this is crazy. But at one point, he gets a letter in the mail that had all these bills like piled up, bills that he owed people who helped him with his work, for electricity, for utilities, for equipment he was buying, with a note kind of scribbled, pay for these bills and the piece is yours. And so this is like David's story, because he said in the end, it's probably less than what it would have cost to buy it in a gallery with, the 50%. And in many ways, this is telling about Namjoon Paik and the way he communicated and thought about his work and the relationship with galleries and the art world in general, although he did start very much as a musician. And it's just a fascinating story. It's also super interesting that right as we speak, 2 days ago, there was an opening of a large exhibition at U Dortmund on Namjoon Paik's work. And that piece, which ended up in the Butler Museum, was then lent out to the U Dortmund. So the timing of this talk is really beautiful. And the person talking and the person responding is amazing. So everybody welcome and enjoy. Thank you, Anuradha, for taking the time to do this and prepare this talk.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Victoria and Bess and Simon. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to Simon to respond. And I'm excited to share with you my thoughts on Namjoon Paik's Cyborg Poetics. Let me share here. Okay. So organic machines, when I saw Paik's work in New York at the Japan Society over a decade ago, I was struck by the organic element of his approach to building and adapting machines for his art. And since that time, I've been thinking extensively about how I want to understand this, and I'm shaping a thesis that I'm going to present to you today. So I'm going to begin here with one of Paik's earliest artworks. This is the one for violin solo, which was performed at the Neo-Dada in der Musik, or Neo-Dada in Music Festival in Düsseldorf on June 16, 1962. In this work, Paik, who is, of course, a classically trained musician who attended conservatory both in Japan and in Germany, is on a bill with prominent avant-garde musicians, including Thomas Schmidt, Wolf Fostel, and Benjamin Patterson. He opens his performance by slowly raising the violin above his head, building suspense, until he eventually reaches the height and then quickly brings it down and smashes it on the table. As the violin connects with the table and smashes, the lights also go out. So to frame this piece a little bit, right, it's a cage-inspired approach in the sense that the action, the physical action, and the form of the instrument as an object provide the sound. Paik was certainly very informed by Cage's idea of preparing pianos with objects inside the strings to change the sound and the tenor and create an avant-garde composition. I think of this very often as the first punk rock artwork because it resembles so much the tendency in the late 60s and beyond for musicians in the punk and rock scenes to destroy their instruments as well. So I think this all speaks to how Paik is trying to bring excitement and thrill and embodiment back to the form of classical music in his early initial efforts as an artist. Now, how does this relate to my thesis? Well, the idea of shattering is really one that I'm going to come back to throughout this talk. Shattering the violin, but shattering the violin as a body. If we think about Man Ray and the Violon d'Ingres with Kiki de Montparnasse posed as an odalisque with F holes on her back, I would associate that kind of embodiment, feminine embodiment in the violin with Paik's work as well, and I'll make a case for that going forward. I want to talk a little bit about shattering as a concept. I'm going to be working here from some text by Leo Bersani, art historian who was writing in the 1980s, from a queer perspective. I'm also going to be speaking from the perspective of Hélène Cixous, French feminist philosopher, about a concept that comes from Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, the concept of jouissance, which is somewhat untranslatable, but in some ways has been described as a shattering of the psyche or the self into a dissociative mass, perhaps. This is a paraphrasing of Bersani's perspective, which is shaped during the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s. So I will develop this in more detail as we go forward. Just want to frame it here for you in the idea that for Paik, the shattering of the violin is the gesture as opposed to its manipulation or instrumentation in a sense. So what does that mean for the human body? I hope to show you. This is Participation TV, which is the work in the David Bermant collection. So this work was originally one of the 13 televisions, as I understand it, in Paik's first solo exhibition at the Galerie Parnasse in Wuppertal, Germany. So this was Paik's first foray into visual art. He prepared 13 televisions. Again, I would say working from this Cagean concept of preparing the instrument and then allowing the physical properties of the prepared instrument to drive the artistic gesture. Here, the body is implied in the sense that in the static image we see here, there are no people speaking or singing into the microphone. If you make a sound into the microphone, the image is going to respond. So it is an early video synthesizer. It does translate audio sound into visual image, and it's working abstractly in a form that resembles the native properties of the cathode ray television. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment, those properties. First, I just want to point out, again, the mouth, the orifice of the mouth is extremely important in this piece, even though you don't see it, because it's through the mouth that we make the sounds that will produce the image. And then I want to talk a little bit about the idea of native resolution. So let me talk about that here. This is the magnet TV, which is a massive industrial magnet. I think this version was reproduced in 1965. Again, cathode ray TV technology is really important to these early television works because the chemistry and the magnetization that produces the televised image can be manipulated by these other forms. So analog synthesizer in the previous image, and here a large industrial magnet, which the public was intended to be able to slide around the top of the TV. I like to note here, of course, that seems rather difficult, if not impossible, for the human body, maybe not that safe for the human body either. It is a very powerful magnet, often used to lift car parts on the assembly line. So here, what the magnet is doing, again, is producing, even more so, I would say, than the participation TV, an image that is intrinsic to the physical and chemical structure of the television. So what we might call a native image, in the sense that it is generated exclusively by the material properties of the television as an object, as opposed to by any human intention or the drive to generate a recognizable image. This work is produced not necessarily for the eye, but rather for the body of the TV itself. And so from the body of the performer generating the image within the TV to the body of the TV being a kind of body itself, I think is an important jump for Paik, and leads us to the next work, which is Robot K456 from 1964, which was created, it was one of Paik's first collaborations with the engineer Jaishri Abe, whose work will also be represented pretty frequently in this talk. So K456 was, in Paik's terms, history's first non-human action artist. He built this robot in Japan. He said it was more difficult and more expensive than my Wuppertal show. He was becoming more ambitious as a visual artist and a maker. So this robot was intended to interact with people. So it was meant to be understood in relation to human bodies. And that's really important, I think, because it has certain elements that are key to humanness and other elements are absent. And to me, a lot of the thesis that I'm advancing here is really oriented toward which elements of humanness are retained or indicated in the robot K456 and which are abandoned or are deemed unnecessary. So if we think for a minute, right, about the cultural differences, this is really, for me, what this is about as an Asian American scholar. I have been thinking about this as a mark of Paik's Asian thinking. Of course, Paik was born in Korea, educated in Japan. His artistic career begins in Germany and then extends into the United States. Posthumously, he's considered one of the great American artists. His work is represented heavily in the Smithsonian collections, as are his archives. So I think it's really interesting, too, how he's a transnational artist. And of course, he's a key Asian American artist. So for my research interests, that's one of many things that brings me always back to Paik. Another is my interest in technology, and specifically post-human technology, the humanization of technology, and also the idea of technology's integration with the human as a way of advancing our species beyond what is evidently a very critical and tender moment for all species on the planet Earth in the face of climate change and the constant threat of global conflict. So with that, I think this robot, which Paik thinks of as a futuristic creature, a kind of a peacemaker, he says the robot was purpose-built, this text, which I think is coming from Media ArtNet, forgive me, says the robot was purpose-built for street actions in which it was supposed to mingle more or less inconspicuously with bypassers. So I think about that because the robot is trying again to meet people and be a kind of an ambassador for the technological future. Paik says, I imagine it would meet people on the street and give them a split-second surprise, like a sudden shower, right? So it's a blast of recognition and also the uncanny, that moment of recognition and simultaneous disassociation. The uncanny, of course, is a term that comes from Freud, and Freud is at the heart of this analysis, although I'm very much interested in updating and looking at people who've updated his take. So that, again, is Bersani and also Hélène Cixous. To bring it back to the robot, what are the elements that do constitute humanness in this robot? Well, he's got a mouth, or they've got a mouth. They are also sexually ambiguous, which I think is really interesting. That speaks, It's a speaker. I cannot actually tell if they have ears. They do have breasts or breast buds that are fleshy, polyurethane. They have fingers. They have feet. They have a digestive tract that can ingest and expel or excrete beans. So this is fascinating to me, because when we think about technology from a Western Enlightenment perspective, when we think about the scientific Enlightenment, which follows, of course, on the Christian Enlightenment, and retains many of its assumptions about hierarchies and values that come from a time when the standardization of the human along the lines of Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man was widespread. So the ideal human, right, is proportional, is masculine coded, is cerebral, and this robot is not really any of those things. It is vocal, it is fleshy, and in terms of what makes it human, it's ambulatory, it's able to produce sound, and it has an ingestion and defecation system. So if Enlightenment thinkers situate the head above the anus in the hierarchy of disembodiment that centers humanity in the intellect and not in the body, which I also argue is a means of lowering the status of those living beings whose bodies are unable to be disassociated from so readily, beginning with women whose menstrual cycle and ability to give birth ties them to a body in the way that men don't always experience, to the animal kingdom. Of course, this rhetoric has also been used in colonial rhetorics of subjugation. And so to deprivilege the head, deprivilege the intellect, and actually to privilege the digestive tract, to not give this being eyes. I guess it has some kind of a camera that allows its pilot to pilot it, but I'm actually not sure about that. Because it is remote controlled. So it could be controlled by radio without having eyes at all. And so retaining that mouth, that physicality of the breast, of the hands, that ability to digest and defecate, to me, centers embodiment and specifically anality, which is the antithesis of cerebral and visual privilege. This, to me, makes the work not only culturally and ontologically Asian, but also queer in a way that I want to develop. So not to say that queer himself, that Paik himself is a queer artist, but rather that he embodies ideas of queerness in the way that he approaches not only the body, but also sexuality in his work. And I think, it's not a hard case to make, as you're going to see. So I'm really interested in this idea of the body of K456 as cyclical rather than hierarchical, and not centered in the eyes and in the head, but rather in the gut and in the anus. Paik's anality is, I think, very much on display in the TV chair, which is a self-surveillance system. You sit in the chair, it films you, and then the image is presented to your own rear end through the transparent acrylic of the seat. Paik predicted, this is Rudolf Freeling writing, he says, that Paik predicted that video technologies would become so integrated into our daily lives that they would blend in with our living environments. Video furniture, video walls. Of course, this is not so futuristic in 2023. TV Chair plays with this notion by proposing an absurd piece of video furniture. I think it's interesting that the museum language uses the word absurd. Is it absurd? Why is it absurd? We assume that the only value to the image is to the eye. But what is the value of the image to the anus? So Freeling says, quote, TV Chair seemingly asks its beholder to sit down, a movement that would effectively prevent them from looking at the TV mounted under the seat. So would the audience here be the individuals behind? Is one supposed to interrupt the live image on screen by fulfilling the implicit request to sit down? Is it a logical choice to either look or sit? I love that Freeling here brings in logic, because my argument is that this is not about logic, and technology does not always have to be logical. This is an organic machine. It is a cyborg poetic, right? It's about how our body integrates with the machine to become something. And in this case, I would say a body that's oriented toward the anus rather than toward the eye. So here again, Paik's interest in anality makes the joke. The logical observer of the image on the TV chair is the anus. To paraphrase Bersani, This is, I'm sorry, kind of a bad joke, but I'm going to make a professor joke. Here, if the rectum is a grave, it is a grave for our self-surveillance or perhaps our self-awareness. Forgive me for that one, Simon. All right, so Paik and Abe make the video synthesizer, and the video synthesizer is central to the next few works that I'm going to look at here. So here, again, from the Namjoon Paik Foundation, Paik wanted to move beyond manipulating a television so that two-way feedback is enabled toward creating a machine that everyone ultimately can play with as if playing the piano. So a lot of his goal here is to work with visual art in a way that is led by the principles of musicality, which brings us back to, modern artists like Kandinsky, who had a very similar interest, or Stuart Davis in the United States, painters. Paik is not a painter, but in some ways he is a video painter. And also he's not a video artist in the sense that he's very bored with the idea that you would have a playback video as your work of art. If the video is not being synthesized in real time, if it's not live, then to him it's a dead object, and that's not really what he's about. So the materialization of the idea of everyone being able to play video in this way is a video synthesizer, which now is fairly ubiquitous and certainly even can be generated with software. But in 1969-72 was a very new technology. And it's worth noting, of course, that a lot of the access to video that artists of Paik's generation, including himself and Shigeko Kubota, had was based on prosumer technologies like the Aeroflex, I believe it was, the mountable wearable Steadicam kind of technologies that allowed people to do things with video that were more accessible than previous. So here, Paik is not only taking advantage of contemporary imaging technologies that are coming from the commercial film and television industry into the hands of first artists and later the general public, but also creating his own new inventions with the engineer Shinya Abe. This machine is able to change the color and shape of video images, input from such external sources as camera on real-time basis. This is again from the Namjoon Paik Foundation item on this work. And it was then broadcast over WGBH. Video Commune was the work. Media Shuttle, New York, Moscow was used for these different works. It doesn't no longer exist, so it's been recreated in 2011, which is the color image, I believe, that we're looking at today. And so ultimately, my point here is that Abe's technology allowed Paik to work with video in real time and fueled his experiments in wearable video tech with Charlotte Moorman. This was an early method of streaming images as a live transmission. And I think it's one that I'm sort of disappointed that fewer artists work with today at a moment when an object like this makes it actually easier than ever to stream a live image and wear it somewhere on your body and be a living, walking piece of wearable video art. So here's a call to all of you watching, especially my students, to please try this out. Use your technologies in a different way. Use your body in a different way. So the great Charlotte Moorman here. Moorman grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. She had been taking cello lessons from the age of 10. She studied at Juilliard. She's a highly accomplished concert cellist. She found that the sexism of the symphony orchestra environment was not a good fit for her. She started to work with avant-garde musicians and artists. She worked with Yoko Ono, who she, I believe, met at Juilliard, and also John Cage. She also performed for Lamont Young. She was the founder of the annual Avant-Garde Festival of New York, and she connected with Paik within weeks of his arrival in New York in 1964, when he had come to just check out the scene, maybe hang out with John Cage. He did not intend to relocate from Germany to New York at this time, but part of the reason why he decided to do so was that he connected with Charlotte Moorman and found in her an invaluable collaborator and co-thinker. So the first sort of excursion that they make, I talked about for my students yesterday, the opera sextronique, which does not involve direct technology, but rather the introduction of Moorman's nude female body into the space of classical music, which is such a great transgression that she is arrested at the start of the performance, and the rest of the performance never concludes, including other artists that were on the bill. I also talked about, and I'm just going to touch on briefly here because it's important, I think, to Moorman's biography, not only how that incident shaped her legacy in terms of being viewed particularly, specifically as a body first, instrumentalist second, and an artist and artistic collaborator only third, if ever at all. But I want to make a case, and will continue to make a case, for Moorman as an active collaborator and an important force in Paik's avant-garde thinking. So she wears here the TV bra, which is meant to, according to Paik, humanize electronics and technology. He says, by using TV as bra, the most intimate belonging of human being, right? The breast, of course, this is me on the side saying, the breast is where we take our life force, right? So there's this huge anxiety about the presence of that life-giving breast in spaces that are designated professional, serious, masculine, intellectual, right? And even clothed, Moorman has this issue, because in the symphony orchestra, or even in the work of Lamont Young, she is criticized for being too sexual, too sensual, too embodied. What I would argue is having too much of the quality that Lacan refers to as jouissance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about jouissance in the body of Charlotte Moorman as well. She has such an incredible sensual presence, and she's a very effusive and outgoing person. She is, in fact, a Southern belle. She has great social graces. She's very feminine, and this causes people to dismiss her. Lacan dismisses jouissance as an excess of pleasure, an excess or a surplus in what has come to be the kind of Marxian terminology for this, is that it represents a surplus or a surfeit of pleasure. And of course, in Marx, a surplus always needs to be redistributed. But Hélène Cixous comes along and she says, well, no, maybe what this is actually an intense anxiety on the part of Freud and Lacan around women's sexuality and the totality with which women experience sexual pleasure, right? Again, that deep embodiment that we as women experience, or female-bodied people, AFAB. So Charlotte Moorman doesn't need to take her shirt off to provoke these responses in people. And when she does, it makes all of that anxiety, it surfaces that anxiety. It exposes even the total prejudice of not charging Paik. He was arrested, but not charged, even though he's the one putting this on, the one staging it, the one taking the credit, but rather Moorman, whose body is criminalized, right? And it takes years for her conviction for indecent exposure to actually be reversed. So it's very important, I think, to redeem Charlotte Moorman of this incident that takes place in '67, which is just at the early stages of their collaboration. So the TV bra, to continue Paik's thinking, we will demonstrate the human use of technology and so stimulate the viewers, not for something mean, but to stimulate their fantasy, to look for the new imaginative and humanistic ways of using technology. So I want to come back again and again to this idea that, especially in our techno-saturated present, we really need to look to Paik and Moorman to reconnect in the flesh, not to become Luddites and to reject the advances that we've made, but rather to experience organic living, even with machines. So Paik says, I consider her, meaning Charlotte Moorman, to be a great video artist. Video art is not just a TV screen and tape. It is a whole life, a new way of life. And I think it's the way of life we have now. So he says the TV screen on her body is literally the embodiment, with a Y, of live video art. Another great quote, these are both from the Gregory Babcock compilation, and this one is from an interview with Paul Schimmel, where Paik says, TV bra and TV cello are interesting because Charlotte did it. If any other lady cellist did it, it would have been just a gimmick. Charlotte's renowned breast symbolizes the agony and achievement of the avant-garde for the past 10 years, right? That cello has rested against that breast in John Cage performances, in Lamont Young performances, right? She's run the Avant-Garde Festival of New York. That renowned breast is the center of the musical avant-garde in New York. When given a choice between, that's me, by the way, side noting, right? When given a choice, Paik says, between truth and convenience, people will always choose convenience. Both artists and distributors are concentrating on videotape making, which is more convenient, whereas my live video art with Charlotte is expensive, clumsy, and as an art object, almost unsaleable, like a piece of truth. It is about time that we make the distinction between video art and videotaped art. So in TV Bra for Living Sculpture, right, there is both the possibility of the wearable object and also the activation of playing the cello, which Moorman accomplished in a variety of ways. So for Paik, this is about continuity. It's when he talks about the opera sextronique, he says, you know, the female nude or the idea of sensuality even. And sexuality is what makes modern literature or modern visual art great. And it is sorely absent from modern classical music. So who cares, essentially, right? So it is about continuity. It's about the continuity of the Western tradition in the nude body of Charlotte Moorman, which approximates a Botticelli, in the playing of avant-garde music on the cello, which is a continuity of the classical tradition. So it's very Western oriented, I want to note. It's the concepts behind it and the way the body is treated that's uniquely Asian. And this is part of the beauty of Paik, is that we can come to him from all of these directions. Just checking my time here. I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 more minutes, if that's okay. Victoria, please keep me on time.
Yes,
so
that's fine. And keep going, don't rush.
Okay, so this is the chroma key bra. The chroma key bra, you know, if you remember chroma key, I don't even know if folks are using it so much anymore, but certainly from the 70s into the 2000s, it was such a major part of video imaging. And actually, I think it is still being used because I was recently scanned in a 3D scan and we stood against a green background, green seamless background as always, right? So the chroma key allows for the insertion of an image into another photographic or video image through compositing. Recently, folks who follow Instagram may remember a couple of years ago, Queen Elizabeth, before her passing at her Jubilee, she wore a green suit that was chroma key green, and folks started comping in different kinds of imagery, corgi patterns, riots, whatever you have into her suit. So that color green has a specific place in the video art lineage. I'll also note Aria Dean's work, contemporary African-American artist, working with technology and sculpture in the most recent Whitney Biennial. She had a sculptural object that was also chroma key green, right? So this concept exists in the popular consciousness and the technological space. So Moorman's body as a site of artistic engagement for Paik references the prevalence of that white female nude in European art. Her physicality, voluptuous, flirtatious, and sensual, introduces jouissance into the scenario that cannot be achieved by a man in a technological system alone. But I also want to note that Charlotte's virtuosity is equally important. Although Paik is classically trained with a conservatory background, he hasn't been actively performing classical music since 1962 or earlier. So he is not the person who can execute his ideas in music. Moorman is the person who has the technical skill and expertise to execute Paik's musical ideas as well. Now another quote from Namjoon Paik. In this case, the sound of the cello she plays will change, modulate, regenerate the picture on her TV bra. So this is about also connecting the cello to the bra as a system that Moorman herself is at the center of. So this makes her a cyborg. TV Brasser, as he says, so old school, for living sculpture is also one sharp example to humanize electronics and technology. Again, yes, I think I repeated a quote here, so I'm not going to do that. But here's the TV cello as a system. Moorman notes that when she is in this system, right, she is constrained by it. She's also synthesizing her own image in real time. In the performance of TV cello, Mormon does also have TV eyes. Note her sort of primitive Google Glass here. From January 18th, this is, from the collection note here, from January 18th through 23rd, 72, cellist Charlotte Mormon and artist Namjoon Paik performed concerto for TV cello and videotape and TV bed at the Everson Museum of Art. For concerto, Mormon played the video cello, an instrument designed by Paik and constructed out of television monitors. And then for TV bed, she played a traditional cello while lying atop an installation of monitors resembling a bed. The Paik Abe video synthesizer was at the root of all of this image production. So Paik was also there to describe and explain his technology. Mormon says here to the Syracuse New Times, quote, all of Paik's pieces are dangerous. Performing the video cello at the Everson, you'd wonder why I don't get electrocuted with all those thousands of wires, end quote. I would argue that the threat of danger to Mormon's body or its potential annihilation enhances the sensation of jouissance as excessive or potentially destructive as it's framed in Lacan, which then transgresses the economies of pleasure and efficiency to suggest something more unruly and wild. I also want to talk about the proliferation of Mormon's body in Paik's work, specifically in the TV garden. So here is an installation, one of many, of the TV garden, where repeated images of Charlotte Mormon are distributed throughout the garden, which is filled with live potted plants and placed inside of a gallery setting. The space is illuminated only by the glow of the televisions, from which Mormon's body emanates as a kind of media specter. Here is a close-up of Mormon. Here's a double image of Mormon, again generated using the Paik Abe video synthesizer. One image of Mormon with an extruded line image of Mormon playing the cello superimposed above her face, embedded here in the garden. I would argue here in TV garden, the shattering of jouissance that takes place in Mormon's body is complete as she proliferates across dozens of TVs planted throughout the garden. Her fecundity and that of the garden are one. So there's no fear of jouissance here. I think Paik is uniquely feminist in his lack of fear in this regard. I also want to point out, because of Paik's known interest in the Buddha, that the proliferation of one into many is an essentially Buddhist idea. And so we might argue that even here, Charlotte Mormon is occupying the persona of Kuan Yin, the bodhisattva, who remains in her embodied corporeal form in order to be a conduit for the people to reach ultimately and attain nirvana. The bodhisattva, in fact, sacrifices her own claim to nirvana in order to distribute that elite circumstance to as many people as possible. And in conclusion, oh, I'm at my conclusion, great. That's good. That means that gives us more time to talk. I'm just going to stop here with the TV fish. So the TV fish here is a sequence of 24 televisions and 24 fish tanks with live fish in aquariums, 3-channel video, which repeats over the 24 circuit. I think it's also been shown as a 16 or 14 circuit, and it's approximately 68 by 288 by 32 inches, 32-inch TVs. You love them. So 24 televisions are placed behind a row of 24 fish tanks, according to the Namjoon Paik Art Center. Live fishes swim around inside the fish tanks, while a series of moving images are played on the TV monitors, such as the dancing Merce Cunningham, swimming fishes in the sea, and a flying airplane in the sky. So the superimposition of a fish tank and a television monitor exerts the effect, they say, of spatiotemporally combining a real fish with a video image of fish. Cunningham is dancing with a fish, fishes are swimming in a sky, and an airplane is floating in the sea. The visual composition in which a fish tank becomes a monitor and vice versa lets viewers look at the video images from a new perspective and perceive the television monitor as a frame defining and constraining what is shown. I would add to that it puts the television in relation to the live bodies of the fish. Fish TV takes my inquiry in a post-human direction. Here, the organic element is freed from the demand that it approximate the human. Already, Paik has deviated from Enlightenment norms by situating genius in the body, and not only in the body, but in the jouissance of Charlotte Mormon, and not in his own masculine intellect. Now he proposes the human body, specifically the queer body of Merce Cunningham, express jouissance for the benefit of other species, in this case, fish. The supremacy of the human eye is subverted once again. The 24 channels suggest a fracturing or a shattering of the structures of signification that we rely on to maintain our social hierarchies and our architectures. The open, rounded mouth of the fish and its constant processing and expulsion of fecal matter bring us back to anality as an organizing characteristic of this work. To conclude, in her influential 2014 essay, Proxy Politics, Signal and Noise, Hito Sterl notes that the human social distinction between the face and anus is lost on the algorithm, to which a face and a butt have equal value, and that value is determined by the level of demand. And we know, by the way, again on my side, that the internet demands pornography more than almost anything else. Human beings require, according to, well, in my note on sterile, human beings require that faces be favored over anuses for cultural reasons, which adds layers of complexity to the task of automated image detection, because what is immediately known to a person is arbitrary or just a proxy in the algorithm system. In this new milieu, Sterile says, quote, humans and things intermingle in ever newer constellations to become bots or cyborgs, end quote. Namjoon Paik's work anticipates the post-representational politics that Sterile describes as our contemporary online condition. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Simon Leung to respond. Take it away, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Amazing.
Wow, that's a tour de force.
That's a big task to follow, right, Simon? So
It is.
just may I ask one question before Simon takes it over? What is your opinion about Charlotte ending up with breast cancer in early 70s, actually? Do you think it's related to being subjected to so much radiation and technological kind of aggression, I guess?
I wouldn't assume that, because we know that breast cancer is also genetic and hereditary. I think it's painfully poetic that the topless cellist was killed by her own breasts.
Yes.
And I do think that certainly we know that artists like Eva Hesse, Gordon Matta Clark developed weird cancers at a young age, possibly from being exposed to materials. We know that artists in that generation took very little caution with their bodies. And I think that's also a sign of the times that, you know, even robot K456, when Paik presents him at the Whitney, sends that robot out into the street to get hit by a car and calls it the first catastrophe of the 21st century. There's a real millenarian destruction. I think there's a sort of Tangley-esque element to all of this. And so, you know, a lot of these artists didn't live a long time. I think it's tragic. I think that Mormon's life overall has a tragic character. And that too is in keeping, I would say, not only with her very feminine characterization and her marginalization, but also with maybe more contemporary ideas around sick girl theory that I'd be interested in exploring. So it's a great direction. I don't have more to say on that. It's hard to have an opinion about someone's breast cancer, but I definitely think it's an interesting note.
It is painfully poetic. I think that's the best way to describe it. So, all right, so we'll let Simon take over. Simon, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to respond.
Thank you so much for having me be a part of this. It's a pleasure to listen to Anu talk about Namjoon Paik. I think that what I think I would want to do is to just touch on a lot of the points that Anu made, and maybe I can, I don't know if I can cohere all of these disparate thoughts, but I'm hoping, you know, that just by picking up on certain threads, we can have a productive discussion. So the first idea that I thought that was very provocative is this idea of thinking through a Bressonian, Freudian register of thinking about what was repressed, right? So what was repressed in the time of Freud, and especially in texts he wrote in the early 20th century was the idea of sex itself. And therefore, when someone like Leo Bersani or various other theorists return to Freud, I think it's actually quite remarkable that I think it's actually very important to think about at what moment do we return to these ideas of repression. So in the case of Namjoon Paik, it would have been the 1960s. And therefore, I think that the repressive dimensions that Freud was talking about, let's say, Vienna of the 19th century, it has a slightly different look in the 1960s, right? Because if the theory for repression is that normative, bourgeois, repressive, Victorian ideas about sex kind of messes everybody up. The answer to that at the time of, early 20th century, late 19th century Freud would be a sort of healthier version of heteronormative sexuality. So I think what Anu is bringing to our attention is that all kinds of things happened in the 1960s, and in some ways Namjoon Paik was a precursor to them, but he was a precursor not so much because he was theorizing the rise of feminist contestations or necessarily even a coherent queering of anything, but rather it is because in Namjoon Paik, he is using video as a type of graphic notation, a graphic representation of that which has been repressed. So in that sense, I think that's the first thing I really want to say, is that the cyclical nature of the drives that the robot K456, what that does is, in a sense, decenter the head from, decenter the hegemony of the head over the loins, and to argue that it is a cyclical dynamic. Another thing that I really want to pick up on is the figure of Charlotte Mormon, right? So I was lucky to see a show at the Gray Art Gallery, maybe, I can't remember how long ago it was, maybe 10 years ago, that was devoted to Charlotte Mormon and her collaborations, I believe between 1960 and 1980. And I think that the way Anu compares Mormon to this idea of Gunyam, the goddess of mercy, is very, very interesting to me. First of all, what the words mean, Gunyam, it means to observe sound. It's in other words, it is a mixing of the senses, a reshuffling of reception. And similar to this idea of the cyclical, it also is a way to think about not only synesthesia, but also the way the body does not function according to these discrete categories of the visual, the bodily, the oral, etc. So that to me is a very apt way of describing this collaboration between Mormon and Paik. But I would, of course, say, if you just look at the works that Anu showed, this is basically Namjoon Paik in essence. The video work in essence is presented as a type of observing of sound. So of course, with magnet TV or with participation, this is literalized, but I think this is a type of aesthetic ethos that is in their work. Maybe what I would really like to discuss with everybody is the idea of the 1960s and the 1970s, right? So, of course, Fluxus was the first movement that I can think of that was in some ways truly international, that it had lots of participants from Europe and Asia and the United States and North America, South America. And in some ways, I think that, is it the artist who finds the times in which he lives in, or she lives in, or they live in, or is it the context that allows a type of intersectional Socratic cross-pollination? So that, I would say, is an open question. And of course, the things that the work of Paik introduces becomes a type of analogic reminder, I think, of our own times. And maybe to think about the 60s versus today, or in connection today, would be very productive. Maybe I should end there.
Can I ask you something to continue on that thread you're bringing up, Simon, and also what very much Anuradha brought to our attention with bringing back Mormon's role. He was a Zen Buddhist, as was John Cage. And if we're going to the 60s, we're very much connecting to that moment where Namjoon actually saw Cage's performance, and he went to it thinking, let's just see how this Western performer is addressing Buddhism. And at first actually was very negative about it from what is being told. But as he sat through the performance, he realized something, like there's like a light bulb going off. And the connection was Zen. And that brings me to also Anuradha's thesis, where she refers to Charlotte as the Kuan Yin, as the kind of a deity in this hierarchy of the Buddhist thought, which I'd love you to comment this, because I think, actually, I really feel strongly that the 60s artists who really made big breakthroughs were those who somehow connected to Eastern philosophies and Buddhism in particular.
Yes, I would be happy to talk about that. Well, first of all, I think this is why I think about the Gunyang not only as a representational figure, but it's a figure of contamination, right? Because Gunyang, it's Buddhist. It came from India, right? And it was a bodhisattva that became Gunyang. And in the transition, I've talked about this a little bit in relationship to my reception of Na Mira, another Asian American artist's work, but in the transition of this figure from India to China, it changed sex. So what was originally a male figure became a female figure. And I think that what is so interesting and important about this in the 1960s is not merely, although I respect this importance of the way in which Suzuki, was influential on John Cage, and in which, in a sense, the going east of the 60s counterculture was very important. But for me, I think it has something to do with a type of intimacy between Asian people and in a sense colonized Asian people, and Japan, of course, being the exception. But in a way, I feel that the relationship between Namjoon Paik and his Japanese collaborators, and his education in Germany, really, in a sense, works out the differences in what I would borrow from Black studies in thinking about the shards of violence. He sort of reworks them. And these shards, I think, come in the form of the video image. I think of them as being, in a sense, refractions of the cathode ray. And in a way, that is the most Buddhist of concepts, right? In other words, the openness to that which is always already violent, always already erotic. And it is not so much to name it as such, but to dwell in it, to be within it. And I think that Paik certainly was one of these figures who embodied this type of aesthetic, ethical condition.
We were just joined by David Famillion, who's actually your colleague at UCI. So David had a question or a comment.
Can I actually just respond to your question quickly, briefly?
Oh, sure, of course.
Good morning. I just wanted to say that I would agree with you that the most interesting innovations in European modernism have been those that are derived from the Western artist's contact with the East. And I would say that that is, in fact, the founding condition of modernism that goes all the way back to William Blake. That's essentially the premise that my global modernism sequence at UCLA is shaped under, is that it's that encounter that we call Japonisme or in Orientalism that, in fact, creates modernism by opening the West to all the ideas that it had closed itself to in the preceding 500 years. So just to respond quickly. David, what's your question?
Sorry, it's wonderful. I'm really super interested in this because of Cage in particular. I mean, what music, sound, noise, what he did was very much Zen. It was, without Zen, it would have never happened. So yes, David, sorry. Got excited there for a moment.
I'm sort of a more pedestrian, I think.
That's okay, bring us down to earth.
I think their unique collaboration between a man and a woman was really unusual, and the kind of partnership they had. And also just Charlotte being part of a group of women that used their body to empower themselves in a variety of ways at the time. But just their collaboration was really unique, and I think was an example for all of us of how to collaborate in an equal dialogue, which was sort of, in some ways, part of Fluxus, at least in the score versus the artist. Not all the artists always collaborated, but the score became a form of collaboration.
Thank you for that comment. Anuradha, do you agree, or do you feel that Charlotte was a bit shadowed over in that collaboration?
I think that compared to the other collaborations that she had with male artists, the collaboration with Paik was significantly more equal. And I would argue that part of that is probably enabled by the fact that neither Paik nor Mormon occupied the status of the norm within the Western society. So therefore, they were already equalized in a lower status by the existence of patriarchy. And so that maybe neutralized some of the challenges she was experiencing in working with white men like Cage, or specifically Lamont Young, who I understand was quite negative about her sensuality as a presence in his work. I do think, though, I might as well take this opportunity to cite the example that I think you may be thinking of, which is Allison Knowles and Dick Higgins, another famous Fluxus pair. I think one interesting difference, though, is that Knowles and Higgins were partners in life and work, whereas specifically, it's worth noting that, as far as we know, there was no romantic or sexual relationship between Paik and Moorman. Not that I think that would change things significantly, but I do think it's very different than, say, if Paik had been doing this work with Shigeko Kubota, who was his wife.
Mhm.
I want to, may I share screen for a second?
Of course.
So I want to show you how I may support David's assertion. So this is yet another moment in avant-garde art where there are women and there are cellists, right? So I think you can see right away what David was getting at in terms of
Right.
anthropometry by Eve Klein. I teach this all the time, so I had the image available, right? So in some ways, I think that uh, the normativization. This is why I wanted to say something about the 60s, right? So the Klein was from 1960. By the by the uh, by the time that Nanjun Paik became a well-known artist and the collaboration with Mormon, by the time that took place towards the later part of the 1960s, a lot of things have changed, right? And then if you were to go to, if I were to think about collaborations between men and women, the one that I think is, in a sense, really moving this a little bit even further forward, a little bit this dynamic forward, would be, of course, the collaboration between Teixing Xie and Linda Montana, in which they were tied at the waist, with a 8-foot-long rope for a year without ever touching one another. So I think that when I'm one of these people who thinks that whenever we theorize a work of art, I want to theorize it from a theoretical, perhaps psychoanalytic, perhaps deconstructionist perspective, but always in relationship to time, the times in which it came from. Because I think different types of enunciation are possible. I think we probably have a way of thinking about Blackness today that we didn't have just 10 years ago, in which, we live in a moment where we're able to articulate, not just merely academically, but in general conversation, the difference between racism and anti-Blackness, so this is the type of, or the cyborg, the way that Anu brings in the cyborg, we didn't really have that type of vocabulary or that understanding. If it weren't for, let's say, Donna Haraway, or nowadays, everybody understands this intrinsically because we're always on our phones. So that's what I would emphasize.
Simon, that picture, that photo is worth 1,000 words. It really shows.
I'm going to add it to my slideshow too.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
It's actually, it also is a testament of how much these performances, how powerful they are, and how they can be reframed depending on what is being discussed, and exactly what you're saying. The photograph itself just made such a huge point, and thank you for sharing that. So, are there any comments? I don't see any questions from the audience. I'm just wondering if there's any final thoughts that the two of you in particular have.
Well, one thought I had about the chroma key green, something that I thought about quite a bit. In my case, it's really to think about the war in Iraq, is how the chroma key green, the green screen technology, really came into being in the 1960s, right? In other words,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
an instrument of the news. And in doing so, it was able to force really incommensurate realities together to make it seem like any type of coherence. And I think that what I think is so important about Namjoon Paik is that his use of TV or video technology was always already wrong. He always used it the wrong way. And I'm of the opinion that all art is wrong or should be wrong, and a lot of art's not wrong enough. At least this is what I tell my students.
Good.
It's really good, but it's not wrong enough, right?
It's not pushing that edge that we need.
So I would just like to make the point that one of the primary repressions, I think, nowadays is how the wrongness of television, the possibility of wrongness of television is something that we should really reflect on.
It would be interesting to see how Namjoon Paik would be responding to ChatGPT and all the AI technologies that are happening now that are considered wrong.
They're wrong, but they're not wrong enough.
Oh, that's what I mean. Like, how
Right.
would,
So
how
I have a
would that
complaint
be
about
broken?
ChatGPT. My complaint about ChatGPT is that neither Namjoon Paik nor Marcel Duchamp have characters on character AI. And I don't understand why Pablo Picasso is the only modern artist on character AI. Because to me, between Duchamp and Paik, you have the perfect venue for like the true absurdity of the ChatGPT technology. So I was disappointed with how pedestrian. I completely agree. It's just not wrong enough.
My interpretation is that because real influence, the mark of real influence is that it's so saturated that it's not even visible. That is basically what power really is, right? That we have it within us. I
love that. It resituates the power in the avant-garde in an important way. Actually, I was thinking about somebody, I don't remember who wrote this, but it was about thinking about undergrounds versus avant-gardes, where avant-gardes are always meant to be co-opted by the mainstream and break through, but undergrounds just live in the underground, and that's where a lot of the inspiration happens. I would just add to corroborate Simon's theory of wrongness here that I think I completely agree with, that to me, performance art exists to make visible the invisible boundaries of society that we don't know we're transgressing till we're transgressing them. So it's a way of surfacing those subsurface structures, making the invisible visible by pointing out where all those social boundaries lie that are so ingrained in us often that we don't even realize they're happening. And it does take an outsider to see the wrongness of everything we think is right and do something wrong to show us how wrong our correctness really is. And definitely, I think when we think about how we as bodies, thinking bodies, are using technology, thinking and loving bodies, using technology, we could really stand to be a lot more wrong.
And a lot of what is considered new is actually not new at all.
Nothing's really new under the sun. We know that.
Exactly.
I was born in 1976. All the good stuff had already happened. Let's just be real.
That's how I felt. I missed the 60s. So everybody feels like they're missing out on something. Speaking of, back to Namjoon Paik, I wanted to recommend this book that I just yesterday got from George Kwasha, who edited and some of it translated too. It was a big job because it was initially in German, a thesis written by Edith Decker Phillips. it certainly doesn't have the new framing because it's almost 20 years old, but it's got a lot of rich history and it's a really well researched thesis. And I'm just so happy and refreshed by this conversation because you brought a completely different perspective. And the whole point of this series is to take a collection that generally can be spoken of in this typical wrong art historical way and just kind of give it another angle, give a new perspective to something that had a big influence at a particular time and can still remain influential, but in a different reframed way. Just to bring up collaboration with a new eyes, just to me, critical. The fact that there's an East Asian perspective that a lot of time gets lost by naming an American artist. And yes, that's what makes America great, but let's remember the roots. And finally, the most important thing that both of you brought to everybody's attention is to think non-hierarchically and non-binary about people in the past too. And just to see how they influence, and in this case, this shattering that Anna was talking about, that's really what a lot of these artists were doing in Fluxus, etc. Really shattering was happening all over the place. And